Italian by Ann Radcliffe.
Chapter 22.
Part 2, read by Gary Day. A recollection of the conduct of Spalatro respecting Elena had thus induced Schedoni to spare him, but this was all. It did not prevail with him to inquire into the condition of this man, or to mitigate his punishment, and without remorse he now left him to his fate. With Elena it was otherwise. Though she was ignorant of the obligation she owed him, she could not know that any human being was left under such circumstances of suffering and solitude, without experiencing very painful emotion. But, considering how expeditiously Spalatro had been able to remove himself, she endeavoured to hope that his wound was not mortal. The travellers, mounting their horses in silence, left the ruin, and were for some time too much engaged by the impression of the late occurrences to converse together. When at length Elena inquired the particulars of what had passed in the avenue, she understood that Schedoni, on pursuing Spalatro, had seen him there only for a moment. Spalatro had escaped by some way unknown to the confessor, and had regained the interior of the ruin while his pursuers were yet following the avenue. The cry which Elena had imagined to proceed from the interior was uttered, as it now appeared, by the guide, who, in his haste, had fallen over some fragments of the wall that lay scattered in the avenue. The first report of arms had been from the trombone, which Schedoni had discharged on reaching the portal, and the last, when he fired a pistol, on perceiving Spalatro passing from the court. "We have had trouble enough in running after this fellow," said the guide, "and could not catch him at last. It is strange that, if he came to look for us, he should run away so when he had found us. I do not think he meant us any harm, after all, else he might have done it easily enough in that dark passage, instead whereof he only took to his heels." "Silence," said Schedoni. "Fewer words, friend." "Well, signor, he's peppered now, however, so we need not be afraid. His wings are clipped for one while, so he cannot overtake us. We need not be in such a hurry, signor. We shall get to the inn in good time yet. It is upon a mountain yonder, whose top you may see upon that red streak in the west. He cannot come after us. I myself saw his arm was wounded." "Did you so?" said Schedoni sharply. "And pray where was you when you saw so much? It was more than I saw." "I was close at your heels, signor, when you fired the pistol." "I do not remember to have heard you there," observed the confessor. "And why did you not come forward instead of retreating? And where also did you hide yourself while I was searching for the fellow, instead of assisting me in the pursuit?" The guide gave no answer, and Elena, who had been attentively observing him during the whole of this conversation, perceived that he was now considerably embarrassed, so that her former suspicions as to his integrity began to revive. Notwithstanding the several circumstances which had occurred to render them improbable, there was, however, at present no opportunity for further observation. Schedoni having, contrary to the advice of the guide, immediately quickened his pace, and the horses continued on the full gallop till a steep ascent compelled them to relax their speed. Contrary to his usual habit, Schedoni now, while they slowly ascended, appeared desirous of conversing with this man, and asked him several questions relative to the villa they had left, and whether it was that he really felt an interest on the subject, or that he just wished to discover if the man had deceived him in the circumstances he had already narrated, from which he might form a judgment as to his general character. He pressed his inquiries with a patient minuteness that somewhat surprised Elena. During this conversation the deep twilight would no longer permit her to notice the countenances of either Schedoni or the guide, but she gave much attention to the changing tones of their voices, as different circumstances and emotions seemed to affect them. It is to be observed that during the whole of this discourse the guide rode at the side of Schedoni. While the confessor appeared to be musing upon something which the peasant had related respecting the Baroni di Cambrusca, Elena inquired as to the fate of the other inhabitants of the villa. "The falling of the old tower was enough for them," replied the guide. "The crash waked them all directly, and they had time to get out of the new buildings before the second and third shocks laid them also in ruins. They ran out into the woods for safety, and found it too, for they happened to take a different road from the earthquake. Not a soul suffered except the Baroni, and he deserved it well enough. Oh, I could tell such things that I have heard of him." "What became of the rest of the family?" interrupted Skidoni. "Why, signor, they were scattered here and there, and everywhere, and they none of them ever returned to the old spot. No, no, they had suffered enough there already, and might have suffered to this day, if the earthquake had not happened." "If it had not happened?" repeated Elena. "Ay, signora, for that put an end to the Baroni. If those walls could but speak, they could tell strange things, for they looked upon sad doings. And that chamber which I showed you, signora, nobody ever went into it by himself except the servant, to keep it in order, and that he could scarcely suffer, and always stayed in the room the while." "He had probably treasure secreted there," said Elena. "No, signora, no treasure. He always had a lamp burning there, and sometimes in the night he has been heard. Once, indeed, his valet happened to—" "Come on," said Skidoni, interrupting him. "Keep pace with me. What idle dream are you relating now?" "It is about the Baroni di Cambrusca, signor, him that you was asking me so much about just now. I was saying what strange ways he had, and how that on one stormy night in December, as my cousin Francisco told my father, who told me, and he lived in the family at the time it happened—" "What happened?" said Skidoni hastily. "What I am going to tell, signor. My cousin lived there at the time, so however unbelievable it may seem, you may depend upon it, it is all true. My father knows I would not believe it myself till—" "Enough of this," said Skidoni. "No more. What family had this Baroni? Had he a wife at this time of this destructive shock?" "Yes, truly, signor, he had, as I was going to tell, if you would but condescend to have patience. The Baroni had more need of that, friend. I have no wife. The Baroni's wife had most need of it. Signor, as you shall hear, a good soul, they say, was the Baronessa, but luckily she died many years before. He had a daughter also, and young as she was, she had lived too long, but for the earthquake which set her free." "How far is it to the inn?" said the confessor roughly. "When we get to the top of this hill, signor, you will see it on the next, if any light is stirring, for there will only be the hollow between us. But do not be alarmed, signor. The fellow we left cannot overtake us. Do you know much about him, signor?" Skidoni inquired whether the trombone was charged, and discovering that it was not, ordered the man to load immediately. "Why, signor, if you knew as much of him as I do, you could not be more afraid," said the peasant, while he stopped to obey the order. "I understood that he was a stranger to you," observed the confessor with surprise. "Why, signor, he is, and he is not. I know more about him than he thinks for." "You seem to know a vast deal too much of other persons' affairs," said Skidoni, in a tone that was meant to silence him. "Why, that is just what he would say, signor. But bad deeds will out, whether people like them to be known or not. This man comes to our town sometimes to market, and nobody knew where he came from for a long while. So they set themselves to work and found it out at last." "We shall never reach the summit of this hill," said Skidoni testily. "And they found out, too, a great many strange things about him," continued the guide. Elena, who had attended to this discourse with a degree of curiosity that was painful, now listened impatiently for what might be further mentioned concerning Spalatro, but without daring to invite, by a single question, any discovery on a subject which appeared to be so intimately connected with Skidoni. "It was many years ago," rejoined the guide, "this man came to live in that strange house on the seashore. It had been shut up ever since—" "What are you talking of now?" interrupted the confessor. "Why, signor, you will never let me tell you. You always snap me up so short at the beginning, and then ask, what am I talking about? I was going to begin the story, and it is a pretty long one. But first of all, signor, who do you suppose this man belonged to? And what do you think the people determined to do when the report was first set a-going? Only that they could not be sure that it was true, and anybody would be unwilling enough to believe such a shocking—" "I have no curiosity on the subject," replied the confessor, sternly interrupting him, "and desire to hear no more concerning it." "I meant no harm, Signor," said the man. "I did not know it concerned you. And who says it does concern me?" "Nobody, Signor. Only you seemed to be in a bit of a passion, and so I thought— But I meant no harm, Signor. Only as he happened to be your guide part of the way, I guessed you might like to know something of him." "All that I desire to know of my guide is, that he does his duty," replied Skedoni, "that he conducts me safely, and understands when to be silent." To this the man replied nothing, but slackened his pace, and slunk behind his reprover. The travellers, reaching soon after the summit of this long hill, looked out for the inn of which they had been told. But darkness now confounded every object, and no domestic light twinkling, however distantly, through the gloom, gave signal of security and comfort. They descended dejectedly into the hollow of the mountains, and found themselves once more immerged in woods. Skedoni again called the peasant to his side, and bade him keep abreast of him; but he did not discourse, and Elena was too thoughtful to attempt conversation. The hints which the guide had thrown out respecting Spalatro had increased her curiosity on that subject; but the conduct of Skedoni, his impatience, his embarrassment, and the decisive manner in which he had put an end to the talk of the guide, excited a degree of surprise that bordered on astonishment. As she had, however, no clue to lead her conjectures on any point, she was utterly bewildered in surmise, understanding only that Skedoni had been much more deeply connected with Spalatro than she had hitherto believed. The travellers, having descended into the hollow, and commenced the ascent of the opposite height, without discovering any symptom of a neighbouring town, began again to fear that their conductor had deceived them. It was now so dark that the road, though the soil was a limestone, could scarcely be discerned, the woods on either side forming a close dungeon of innumerous boughs that totally excluded the twilight of the stars. While the confessor was questioning the man with some severity, a faint shout was heard from a distance, and he stopped the horses to listen from what quarter it came. "That comes the way we are going, Signor," said the guide. "Hark!" exclaimed Skedoni. "Those are strains of revelry." A confused sound of voices, laughter, and musical instruments was heard, and as the air blew stronger, tambourines and flutes were distinguished. Oh, we are near the end of our journey," said the peasant. "All this comes from the town we are going to. But what makes them all so merry, I wonder?" Elena, revived by this intelligence, followed with alacrity the sudden speed of the confessor, and presently, reaching a point on the mountain where the woods opened, a cluster of lights on another summit, a little higher, more certainly announced the town. They soon after arrived at the ruinous gates which had formerly led to a place of some strength, and passed at once from darkness and desolated walls into a marketplace blazing with light and resounding with the multitude. Booths, fantastically hung with lamps and filled with merchandise of every kind, disposed in the gayest order, were spread on all sides, and peasants in their holiday clothes and parties of masks crowded every avenue. Here was a band of musicians, and there a group of dancers. On one spot the outre humour of a zany provoked the never-failing laugh of an Italian rabble. In another, the improvisatore, by the pathos of his story and the persuasive sensibility of his strains, was holding the attention of his auditors, as in the bands of magic. Further on was a stage raised for the display of fireworks, and near this a theatre, where a comic opera, The Shadow of a Shade, was exhibiting, whence the roar of laughter excited by the principal buffo within mingled with the heterogeneous voices of the vendors of ice, macaroni, sherbet, and diavoloni without. The confessor looked upon this scene with disappointment and ill humour, and bade the guide go before him and show the way to the best inn, an office which the latter undertook with great glee, though he made his way with difficulty. "To think I should not know it was the time of the fair," said he, "though, to say truth, I never was at it but once in my life." so it is not so surprising, signor." "Make way through the crowd," said Skidoni. "After jogging on so long in the dark, signor, with nothing at all to be seen," continued the man, without attending to the direction, "then to come all of a sudden to such a place as this, why, it is like coming out of purgatory into paradise. Well, signor, you have forgot all your quandaries now. You think nothing about that old ruinous place where we had such a race after the man that would not murder us, but that shot I fired did his business." "You fired?" said Skidoni, aroused by the assertion. "Yes, signor. As I was looking over your shoulder, I should have thought you must have heard it." "I should have thought so too, friend." "Ay, signor, this fine place has put all of that out of your head, I warrant, as well as what I said about that same fellow. But indeed, signor, I did not know he was related to you when I talked so of him. But perhaps, for all that, you may not know the piece of his story I was going to tell you, when you cut me off so short, though you are better acquainted with one another than I guessed for. So when I come in from the fair, signor, if you please, I will tell you of it, and it is a pretty long history, for I happen to know the whole of it, though where you cut me short, when you was in one of those quandaries, was only just at the beginning. But no matter for that. I can begin it again, for—" "What is all this?" said Skidoni, again recalled from one of the thoughtful moods in which he had so habitually indulged, that even the bustle around him had failed to interrupt the course of his mind. He now bade the peasant to be silent, but the man was too happy to be tractable, and proceeded to express all he felt as they advanced slowly through the crowd. Every object here was to him new and delightful, and nothing doubting that it must be equally so to every other person, he was continually pointing out to the proud and gloomy professor the trivial subjects of his own admiration. "See, signor, there is Punchinello. See how he eats the hot macaroni. And look there, signor, there is a juggler. Oh, good signor, stop 1 minute to look at his tricks. See, he has turned a monk into a devil already, in the twinkling of an eye." "Silence, and proceed," said Skidoni. "That is what I say, signor. Silence, for the people make such a noise that I cannot hear a word you speak. Silence there!" "Considering that you could not hear, you have answered wonderfully to the purpose," said Helena. "Ah, signor, is not this better than those dark woods and hills? But what have we here? Look, signor, here is a fine sight." The crowd, which was assembled round a stage on which some persons grotesquely dressed were performing, now interrupting all further progress, the travellers were compelled to stop at the foot of the platform. The people above were acting what seemed to have been intended for a tragedy, but what their strange gestures, uncouth recitation, and incongruous countenances had transformed into a comedy. Skidoni, thus obliged to pause, withdrew his attention from the scene. Helena consented to endure it, and the peasant, with gaping mouth and staring eyes, stood like a statue, yet not knowing whether he ought to laugh or cry, till suddenly turning round to the confessor, whose horse was of necessity close to his, he seized his arm, and pointing to the stage, called out, "Look, signor! See, signor! What a scoundrel! What a villain! See, he has murdered his own daughter!" At these terrible words, the indignation of Skidoni was done away by other emotions. He turned his eyes upon the stage, and perceived that the actors were performing the story of Virginia. It was at the moment when she was dying in the arms of her father, who was holding up the poniard with which he had stabbed her. The feelings of Skidoni at this instant inflicted a punishment almost worthy of the crime he had meditated. Helena, struck with the action and with the contrast which it seemed to offer to what she had believed to have been the late conduct of Skidoni towards herself, looked at him with most expressive tenderness, and as his glance met hers, she perceived with surprise the changing emotions of his soul, and the inexplicable character of his countenance. Stung to the heart, the confessor furiously spurred his horse that he might escape from the scene, but the poor animal was too spiritless and jaded to force his way through the crowd, and the peasant, vexed at being hurried from a place where, almost for the first time in his life, he was suffering under the strange delights of artificial grief, and half angry to observe an animal of which he had the care ill-treated, loudly remonstrated and seized the bridle of Skidoni, who, still more incensed, was applying the whip to the shoulders of the guide, when the crowd suddenly fell back and opened a way, through which the travellers passed, and arrived, with little further interruption, at the door of the inn. Skidoni was not in a humour which rendered him fit to encounter difficulties, and still less the vulgar squabbles of a place already crowded with guests. Yet it was not without much opposition that he at length obtained a lodging for the night. The peasant was not less anxious for the accommodation of his horses, and when Elena heard him declare that the animal which the confessor had so cruelly spurred should have a double feed, and a bed of straw as high as his head, if he himself went without one, she gave him, unnoticed by Skidoni, the only ducat she had left. End of
Chapter 22.
Part 2.
The Italian by Ann Radcliffe. Chapter 23. But if you be afraid to hear the worst, then let the worst unheard fall on your head. Shakespeare. Skidoni passed the night without sleep. The incident of the preceding evening had not only renewed the agonies of remorse, but excited those of pride and apprehension. There was something in the conduct of the peasant towards him which he could not clearly understand, though his suspicions were sufficient to throw his mind into a state of the utmost perturbation. Under an air of extreme simplicity, this man had talked of Spalatro, had discovered that he was acquainted with much of his history, and had hinted that he knew by whom he had been employed, yet at the same time appeared unconscious that Skidoni's was the master hand which had directed the principal actions of the ruffian. At other times his behavior had seemed to contradict the supposition of his ignorance on this point. From such circumstances he had mentioned it appeared impossible but that he must have known who Skidoni really was, and even his own conduct had occasionally seemed to acknowledge this, particularly when, being interrupted in the history of Spalatro, he attempted an apology by saying he did not know it concerned Skidoni, nor could the conscious Skidoni believe that the very pointed manner in which the peasant had addressed him at the representation of Virginia was merely accidental. He wished to dismiss the man immediately, but it was first necessary to ascertain what he knew concerning him, and then decide on the measures to be taken. It was, however, a difficult matter to obtain this information without manifesting an anxiety which might betray him if the guide had at present only a general suspicion of the truth, and no less difficult to determine how to proceed towards him if it should be evident that his suspicions rested on Spalatro. To take him forward to Naples was to bring an informer to his home, to suffer him to return with his discovery now that he probably knew the place of Skidoni's residence was little less hazardous. His death could only secure the secret. After a night passed in the tumult of such considerations, the confessor summoned the peasant to his chamber, and, with some short preface, told him he had no further occasion for his services, adding carelessly that he advised him to be on his guard as he repassed the villa, lest Spalatro, who might yet lurk there, should revenge upon him the injury he had received. "According to your account of him, he is a very dangerous fellow," said Skidoni, "but your information is, perhaps, erroneous." The guide began testily to justify himself for his assertions, and the confessor then endeavored to draw from him what he knew on the subject. But whether the man was piqued by the treatment he had lately received, or had other reasons for reserve, he did not at first appear so willing to communicate as formerly. "What you hinted of this man," said Skidoni, "has in some degree excited my curiosity. I have now a few moments of leisure, and you may relate, if you will, something of the wonderful history you talked of." "It is a long story, signor, and you would be tired before I got to the end of it," replied the peasant. and craving your pardon, senor. I don't much like to be snapped up so." "Where did this man live?" said the confessor. "You mentioned something of a house at the seaside." "Ay, senor, there is a strange history belonging to that house too. But this man, as I was saying, came there all of a sudden, nobody knew how, and the place had been shut up ever since the Marchesa—" "The Marchesa?" said Schedoni coldly. "What Marchesa, friend?" "Why, I mean the Barone di Cambrusca, senor, to be sure, as I was going to have told you of my own accord, if you had only let me. Shut up ever since the Barone. I left off there, I think." "I understood that the Barone was dead," observed the confessor. "Yes, senor," replied the peasant, fixing his eyes on Schedoni. "But what has his death to do with what I was telling? This happened before he died." Schedoni, somewhat disconcerted by this unexpected remark, forgot to resent the familiarity of it. "This man, then, this Spillatro, was connected with the Barone di Cambrusca?" said he. "It was pretty well guessed so, senor." "How? No more than guessed?" "No, senor, and that was more than enough for the Barone's liking, I warrant. He took too much care for anything certain to appear against him, and he was wife so to do, for if it had, it would have been worse for him. But I was going to tell you the story, senor." "What reasons were there for believing this was an agent of the Barone di Cambrusca, friend?" "I thought you wished to hear the story, senor." "In good time. But first, what were your reasons?" "One of them is enough, senor, and if you would only have let me go straight on with the story, you would have found it out by this time, senor." Schedoni frowned, but did not otherwise reprove the impertinence of the speech. "It was reason enough, senor, to my mind," continued the peasant, "that it was such a crime as nobody but the Barone di Cambrusca could have committed. There was nobody wicked enough in our parts to have done it but him. Why is not this reason enough, senor? What makes you look at me so? Why, the Barone himself could hardly have looked worse, if I told him as much." "Be less prolix," said the confessor, in a restrained voice. "Well, then, senor, to begin at the beginning, it is a good many years ago that Marco came first to our town. Now the story goes that one stormy night—" "You may spare yourself the trouble of relating your story," said Schedoni, abruptly. "Did you ever see the Barone you were speaking of, friend?" "Why did you bid me to tell it, senor, if you know it already? I have been here all this time just a-going to begin it, and all for nothing." "It is very surprising," resumed the artful Schedoni, without having noticed what had been said, "that if this Spillatro was known to be the villain you say he is, not any steps should have been taken to bring him to justice. How happened that? But perhaps all this story was nothing more than a report." "Why, senor, it was everybody's business, and nobody's, as one may say. Then, besides, nobody could prove what they had heard, and though everybody believed the story just the same as if they had seen the whole, yet that, they said, would not do in law, but they should be made to prove it. Now, it is not one time in 10 that anything can be proved, senor, as you well know, yet we none of us believe it the less for that." "So, then, you would have this man punished for a murder which probably he never committed," said the confessor. "A murder!" replied the peasant. Schedoni was silent, but in the next instant said, "Did you not say it was a murder?" "I have not told you so, senor." "What was the crime, then?" resumed Schedoni, after another momentary pause. "You said it was atrocious. And what more so than murder?" His lip quivered as he pronounced the last word. The peasant made no reply, but remained with his eyes fixed upon the confessor, and at length repeated, "Did I say it was murder, senor?" If it was not that, say what it was, demanded the confessor haughtily, but let it be in 2 words. As if a story could be told in 2 words, senor. Well, be brief. How can I, senor, when the story is so long? I will waste no more time, said Schedoni, going. Well, senor, I will do my best to make it short. It was one stormy night in December that Marco Torma had been out fishing. Marco, senor, was an old man that lived in our town when I was a boy. I can but just remember him, but my father knew him well, and loved old Marco, and used often to say, "To the story," said Schedoni. Why, I am telling it, senor, as fast as I can. This old Marco did not live in our town at the time it happened, but in some place, I have forgot the name of it, near the seashore. What can the name be? It's something like, well, what happened to the old dotard? You are out there, senor. He was no old dotard, but you shall hear. At that time, senor, Marco lived in this place that I have forgot the name of, and was a fisherman. But better times turned up afterwards. But that is neither here nor there. Old Marco had been out fishing. It was a stormy night, and he was glad enough to get on shore, I warrant. It was quite dark, as dark, senor, I suppose, as it was last night. And he was making the best of his way, senor, with some fish along the shore. But it being so dark, he lost it notwithstanding. The rain beat, and the wind blew, and he wandered about a long while, and could see no light, nor hear anything but the surge near him, which sometimes seemed as if it was coming to wash him away. He got as far off it as he could, but he knew there were high rocks over the beach, and he was afraid he should run his head against them, if he went too far, I suppose. However, at last he went up close to them, and as he got a little shelter, he resolved to try no further for the present. I tell it to you, senor, just as my father told it to me, and he had it from the old man himself. You need not be so particular, replied the confessor. Speak to the point. Well, senor, as old Marco lay snug under the rocks, he thought he heard somebody coming, and he lifted up his head. I warrant the poor old soul, as if he could have seen who it was. However, he could hear, though it was so dark, and he heard the steps coming on, but he said nothing yet, meaning to let them come up close to him before he discovered it himself. Presently he sees a little moving light, and it comes nearer and nearer, till it was just opposite of him, and then he saw the shadow of a man on the ground, and then spied the man himself, with a dark lanthorn passing along the beach. Well, to the purpose, said Schedoni. Old Marco, senor, what my father says, was never stout-hearted. He took it into his head that this might be a robber, because he had the lanthorn, though, for that matter, he would have been glad enough of a lanthorn himself, and so he lay quiet. But presently he was in a rare fright, for the man stopped to rest the load he had upon his back on a piece of rock near him, and old Marco saw him throw off a heavy sack, and heard him breathe hard, as if he was hugely tired. I tell it, senor, just as my father does. What was in the sack? Said Schedoni coolly. All in good time, senor. Perhaps old Marco never found out, but you shall hear. He was afraid when he saw the sack to stir a limb, for he thought it held booty. But presently the man, without saying a word, heaved it on his shoulders again, and staggered away with it along the beach, and Marco saw no more of him. Well, what has he to do with your story, then? Said the confessor. Was this Spalatro? All in good time, senor. You put me out. When the storm was down a little, Marco crept out, and thinking there must be a village or a hamlet or a cottage at no great distance since the man had passed, he thought he would try a little further. He had better have stayed where he was, for he wandered about a long while and could see nothing, and what was worse, the storm came on louder than before, and he had no rocks to shelter him now. While he was in a quandary, he sees a light at a distance, and it came into his head that this might be the lantern again. But he determined to go on notwithstanding, for if it was, he could stop short, and if it was not, he could get shelter perhaps. So on he went, and I suppose I should have done the same, Signor. "Well, this history never will have an end," said Schedoni. "Well, Signor, he had not gone far when he found out it was no lantern, but a light at a window. When he came up to the house, he knocked softly at the door, but nobody came." "What house?" inquired the confessor sharply. "The rain beat hard, Signor, and I warrant poor old Marco waited a long time before he knocked again, for he was main patient, Signor. Oh, how I have seen him! Listen to a story, let it be ever so long." "I have need of his patience," said Schedoni. "When he knocked again, Signor, the door gave way a little, and he found it was open, and so, as nobody came, he thought fit to walk in of his own accord." "The dotard! What business had he to be so curious?" exclaimed Schedoni. "Curious, Signor! He only sought shelter. He stumbled about in the dark for a good while, and could find nobody, nor make nobody hear. But at last he came to a room where there was some fire not quite out upon the hearth, and he went up to it to warm himself till somebody should come." "What! Was there nobody in the house?" said the confessor. "You shall hear, Signor. He had not been there. He said no, he was sure, not above 2 minutes, when he heard a strange sort of a noise in the very room where he was, but the fire gave such a poor light he could not see whether anybody was there." "What was the noise?" "You put me out, Signor. He said he did not much like it, but what could he do? So he stirred up the fire, and tried to make it blaze a little, but it was as dusky as ever. He could see nothing. Presently, however, he heard somebody coming, and saw a light, and then a man coming towards the room where he was. So he went up to him to ask shelter." "Who was this man?" said Schedoni. "Ask shelter. He says the man, when he came to the door of the room, turned as white as a sheet, as well he might, to see a stranger, to find a stranger there at that time of the night. I suppose I should have done the same myself. The man did not seem very willing to let him stay, but asked him what he did there, and such like. But the storm was very loud, and so Marco did not let a little matter daunt him. And when he shewed the man what fine fish he had in his basket, and said he was welcome to it, he seemed more willing." "Incredible!" exclaimed Schedoni. "The blockhead!" "He had wit enough for that matter, Signor. Marco says he appeared to be main hungry." "Is that any proof of his wit?" said the confessor peevishly. "You never will let me finish, Signor. Main hungry, for he put more wood on the fire directly to dress some of the fish. While he was doing this, Marco says his heart somehow misgave him that this was the man he saw on the beach, and he looked at him pretty hard till the other asked him crossly what he stared at him so for. But Marco took care not to tell. While he was busy making ready the fish, however, Marco had an opportunity of eyeing him the more, and every time the man looked around the room, which happened to be pretty often, he had a notion it was the same." "Well, and if it was the same?" said Schedoni. But when Marco happened to spy the sack lying in a corner, he had no doubt about the matter. He says his heart then misgave him sadly, and he wished himself safe out of the house, and determined in his own mind to get away as soon as he could, without letting the man suspect what he had thought of him. He now guessed, too, What made the man look around the room so often? And though Marco thought it before it was to find out if he had brought any body with him, he now believed it was to see whether his treasure was safe. "Aye, likely enough," observed Schedoni. Well, old Marco sat not much at his ease. While the fish was preparing, he thought it was out of the frying pan into the fire with him. But what could he do? "Why, get up and walk away, to be sure," said the confessor, "as I shall do if your story lasts much longer." "You shall hear, senor. He would have done so if he had thought this man would have let him, but—" "Well, this man was Spalatro, I suppose," said Schedoni impatiently, "and this was the house on the shore you formerly mentioned." "How well you have guessed it, senor! Though, to say truth, I have been expecting you to find it out for this half-hour." Schedoni did not like the significant look which the peasant assumed while he said this, but he bade him proceed. "At first, senor, Spalatro hardly spoke a word, but he came to by degrees, and by the time the fish was nearly ready, he was talkative enough." Here the confessor rose with some emotion and paced the room. "Poor old Marco, senor, began to think better of him, and when he heard the rain at the casements, he was loath to think of stirring. Presently Spalatro went out of the room for a plate to eat the fish on." "Out of the room?" said Schedoni, and checked his steps. "Yes, senor, but he took care to carry the light with him. However, Marco, who had a deal of curiosity—" "Yes, he appears to have had a great deal indeed," said the confessor, and turning away renewed his pace. "Nay, senor, I am not come to that yet, and he has shewn none yet. A great deal of curiosity to know what was in the sack before he consented to let himself stay much longer. Thought this a good opportunity for looking, and as the fire was now pretty bright, he determined to see. He went up to the sack, therefore, senor, and tried to lift it, but it was too heavy for him, though it did not seem full." Schedoni again checked his steps and stood fixed before the peasant. "He raised it, however, a little, senor, but it fell from his hands, and with such a heavy weight upon the floor that he was sure it held no common booty. Just then, he says, he thought he heard Spalatro coming, and the sound of the sack was enough to have frightened him, and so Marco quitted it. But he was mistaken, and he went to it again." "But you don't seem to hear me, senor, for you look as you do when you are in those quandaries, so busy a-thinking, and I—" "Proceed," said Schedoni sternly, and renewed his steps. "I hear you." "Went to it again," resumed the peasant, cautiously taking up the story at the last words he had dropped. "He untied the string, senor, that held the sack, and opened the cloth a little way. But think, senor, what he must have thought when he felt cold flesh. Oh, senor, and when he saw by the light of the fire the face of a corpse within. Oh, senor!" The peasant, in the eagerness with which he related this circumstance, had followed Schedoni to the other end of the chamber, and he now took hold of his garment, as if to secure his attention to the remainder of the story. The confessor, however, continued his steps, and the peasant kept pace with him, still loosely holding his garment. "Marco," he resumed, "was so terrified, as my father says, that he hardly knew where he was, and I warrant, if one could have seen him, he looked as white, senor, as you do now." The confessor abruptly withdrew his garment from the peasant's grasp, and said in an inward voice, "If I am shocked at the mere mention of such a spectacle, no wonder he was who beheld it." After the pause of a moment, he added, "But what followed?" "Marco says he had no power to tie up the cloth again, senor, and when he came to his thoughts, His only fear was lest Spillatro should return, though he had hardly been gone a minute before he could get out of the house, for he cared nothing about the storm now. And sure enough, he heard him coming, but he managed to get out of the room into a passage another way from that Spillatro was in. And luckily, too, it was the same passage he had come in by, and it led him out of the house. He made no more ado, but ran straight off without stopping to choose which way, and many perils and dangers he had got into among the woods that night. And how happened it that this Spillatro was not taken up after this discovery? Said Schedoni. What was the consequence of it? Why, Signor, old Marco had like to have caught his death that night. What with the wet and what with the fright, he was laid up with fever, and was light-headed, and raved of such strange things that people would not believe anything he said when he came to his senses. Aye, said Schedoni, the narrative resembles a delirious dream more than a reality. I perfectly accord with them in their opinion of this feverish old man. But you shall hear, Signor, after a while they began to think better of it, and there was some stir made about it. But what could poor folks do, for nothing could be proved? The house was searched, but the man was gone, and nothing could be found. From that time the place was shut up, till many years after this Spillatro appeared, and old Marco then said he was pretty sure he was the man, but he could not swear it, and so nothing could be done. Then it appears, after all, that you are not certain that this long history belongs to this Spillatro, said the confessor. Nay, not even that the history itself is anything more than the vision of a distempered brain. I do not know, Signor, what you may call certain, but I know what we all believe. But the strangest part of the story is yet to come, and that which nobody would believe, hardly if— I have heard enough, said Schedoni. I will hear no more. Well, but, Signor, I have not told you half yet, and I am sure when I heard it myself it so terrified me. I have listened too long to this idle history, said the confessor. There seems to be no rational foundation for it. Here is what I owe you. You may depart. Well, Signor, 'tis plain you know the rest already, or you never would go without it. But you don't know, perhaps, Signor, what an unaccountable— I am sure it made my hair stand on end to hear of it— what an unaccountable— I will hear no more of this absurdity, interrupted Schedoni with sternness. I reproach myself for having listened so long to such a gossip's tale, and have no further curiosity concerning it. You may withdraw, and bid the host attend me. Well, Signor, if you are so easily satisfied, replied the peasant, with disappointment, there is no more to be said. But you may stay, however, while I caution you, said Schedoni, how you pass the villa where this Spillatro may yet linger, for, though I can only smile at the story you have related— Related, Signor! Why, I have not told it half. And if you would only please to be patient— Though I can only smile at that simple narrative, repeated Schedoni in a louder tone. Nay, Signor, for that matter, you can frown at it too, as I can testify, muttered the guide. Listen to me, said the confessor in a yet more insisting voice. I say that though I give no credit to your curious history, I think this same Spillatro appears to be a desperate fellow, and therefore I would have you be on your guard. If you see him, you may depend upon it that he will attempt your life in revenge of the injury I have done him. I give you, therefore, in addition to your trombone, the stiletto to defend you. Schedoni, while he spoke, took an instrument from his bosom, but it was not the one he usually wore, or at least that he was seen to wear. He delivered it to the peasant, who received it with a kind of stupid surprise, and then gave him some directions as to the way in which it should be managed. "Why, signor," said the man, who had listened with much attention, "I am kindly obliged to you for thinking about me, but is there anything in this stiletto different from others, that it should be used so?" Schedoni looked gravely at the peasant for an instant, and then replied, "Certainly not, friend. I would only instruct you to use it to the best advantage. Farewell." "Thank you kindly, signor, but I think I have no need of it. My trombone is enough for me." "This will defend you more adroitly," replied Schedoni, refusing to take back the stiletto. "And moreover, while you were loading the trombone, your adversary might use his poniard to advantage. Keep it, therefore, friend. It will protect you better than a dozen trombones. Put it up." Perhaps it was Schedoni's particular look more than his argument that convinced the guide of the value of his gift. He received it submissively, though with a stare of stupid surprise. Probably it had been better if it had been a suspicious surprise. He thanked Schedoni again, and was leaving the room when the confessor called out, "Send the landlord to me immediately. I shall set off for Rome without delay." "Yes, signor," replied the peasant. "You are at the right place. The road parts here. But I thought you was going for Naples." "For Rome," said Schedoni. "For Rome, signor? Well, I hope you will get safe, signor, with all my heart," said the guide, and quitted the chamber. While this dialogue had been passing between Schedoni and the peasant, Elena, in solitude, was considering on the means of prevailing with the confessor to allow her to return either to Altieri or to the neighboring cloister of Our Lady of Pity, instead of placing her at a distance from Naples, till he should think proper to acknowledge her. The plan which he had mentioned seemed to her long harassed mind to exile her forever from happiness and all that was dear to her affections. It appeared like a second banishment to San Stefano, and every abbess, except that of Santa della Pieta, came to her imagination in the portraiture of an inexorable jailer. While this subject engaged her, she was summoned to attend Schedoni, whom she found impatient to enter the carriage, which at this town they had been more able to procure. Elena, on looking out for the guide, was informed that he had already set off for his home, a circumstance for the suddenness of which she knew not how to account. The travelers immediately proceeded on their journey. Schedoni, reflecting on the late conversation, said little, and Elena read not in his countenance anything that might encourage her to introduce the subject of her own intended solicitation. Thus separately occupied they advanced, during some hours, on the road to Naples, for thither Schedoni had designed to go, notwithstanding his late assertion to the guide, whom it appears, for whatever reason, he was anxious to deceive as to the place of his actual residence. They stopped to dine at a town of some consideration, and when Elena heard the confessor inquire concerning the numerous convents it contained, she perceived that it was necessary for her no longer to defer her petition. She therefore represented immediately what must be the forlornness of her state and the anxiety of her mind if she were placed at a distance from the scenes and the people which affection and early habit seemed to have consecrated, especially at this time when her spirits had scarcely recovered from the severe pressure of long suffering, and when to soothe and renovate them, not only quiet, but the consciousness of security were necessary, a consciousness which it was impossible, and especially so after her late experience, that she could acquire among strangers till they should cease to be such. These pleadings Schedoni thoughtfully attended, but the darkness of his aspect did not indicate that his compassion was touched, and Elena proceeded to represent, secondly, that which, had she been more artful or less disdainful of cunning, she would have urged the first. As it was, she had begun with the mention of circumstances, which, though the least likely to prevail with Schedoni, she felt to be most important to herself, and she concluded with representing that which was most interesting to him. Elena suggested that her residence in the neighborhood of Altieri might be so managed as that his secret would be as effectually preserved as if she were at 100 miles from Naples. It may appear extraordinary that a man of Schedoni's habitual coolness and exact calculation should have suffered fear on this occasion to obscure his perceptions, and this instance strongly proved the magnitude of the cause which could produce so powerful an effect. While he now listened to Helena, he began to perceive circumstances that had eluded his own observation, and he at length acknowledged that it might be safer to permit her to return to the Villa Altieri, and that she should from thence go, as she had formerly intended, to the Santa della Pieta, than to place her in any convent, however remote, where it would be necessary for himself to introduce her. His only remaining objection to the neighborhood of Naples now rested on the chance it would offer the Marchesa di Vivaldi of discovering Elena's abode, before he could judge it convenient to disclose to her his family, and his knowledge of the Marchesa justified his most horrible suspicion as to the consequence of such a premature discovery. Something, however it appeared, must be risked in any situation he might choose for Elena, and her residence at the Santa della Pieta, a large convent, well secured, and where, as she had been known to them from her infancy, the abbess and the sisters might be supposed to be not indifferent concerning her welfare, seemed to promise security against any actual violence from the malice of the Marchesa. Against her artful duplicity every place would be almost equally insufficient. Here, as Elena would appear in the character she had always been known in, no curiosity could be excited, or suspicion awakened as to her family, and here therefore Schedoni's secret would more probably be preserved than elsewhere. As this was, after all, the predominant subject of his anxiety, to which, however unnatural it may seem, even the safety of Elena was secondary, he finally determined that she would return to the Santa della Pieta, and she thanked him almost with tears for a consent which she received as a generous indulgence, but which was in reality little more than an effect of selfish apprehension. The remainder of the journey, which was of some days, passed without any remarkable occurrence. Schedoni, with only short intervals, was still enveloped in gloom and silence, and Elena, with thoughts engaged by the one subject of her interest, the present situation and circumstances of Vivaldi, willingly submitted to this prolonged stillness. As at length she drew near Naples, her emotions became more various and powerful, and when she distinguished the top of Vesuvius peering over every intervening summit, she wept as her imagination characterized all the well-known country it overlooked. But when, having reached an eminence, that scenery was exhibited to her senses, when the Bay of Naples, stretching to its remotest distance, was spread out over her, when every mountain of that magnificent horizon which enclosed her native landscape, that country which she believed Vivaldi to inhabit, stood unfolded, how affecting, how overwhelming were her sensations! Every object seemed to speak of her home, of Vivaldi, and of happiness that was past, and so exquisitely did regret mingle with hope, the tender grief of remembrance with the interest of expectation, that it were difficult to say which prevailed. Her expressive countenance disclosed to the confessor the course of her thoughts and of her feelings, feelings which, while he contemned, he believed he perfectly comprehended, but of which, having never in any degree experienced them, he really understood nothing. The callous Schedoni, by a mistake not uncommon, especially to a mind of his character, substituted words for truths, not only confounding the limits of neighboring qualities, but mistaking their very principles. Incapable of perceiving their nice distinctions, he called the persons who saw them merely fanciful, thus making his very incapacity an argument for his superior wisdom. And while he confounded delicacy of feeling with fatuity of mind, taste with caprice, and imagination with error, he yielded, when he most congratulated himself on his sagacity, to illusions not less egregious because they were less brilliant than those which are incident to sentiment and feeling. The better to escape observation, Schedoni had contrived not to reach Naples till the close of evening, and it was entirely dark before the carriage stopped at the gate of the Villa Altieri. Elena, with a mixture of melancholy and satisfaction, viewed once more her long deserted home, and while she waited till a servant should open the gate, remembered how often she had thus waited when there was a beloved friend within, to welcome her with smiles, which were now gone forever. Beatrice, the old housekeeper, at length, however, appeared, and received her with an affection as sincere, if not as strong, as that of the relative for whom she mourned. Here Schedoni alighted, and having dismissed the carriage, entered the house for the purpose of relinquishing also his disguise, and resuming his monk's habit. Before he departed, Elena ventured to mention Vivaldi, and to express her wish to hear his exact situation, but though Schedoni was too well enabled to inform her of it, the policy which had hitherto kept him silent on this subject still influenced him, and he replied only that if she should happen to learn the circumstances of his condition, she should not remain ignorant of them. This assurance revived Elena for two reasons. It afforded her a hope of relief from her present uncertainty, and it also seemed to express the approbation of the object of her affection, such as the confessor had never yet disclosed. Schedoni added that he should see her no more, till he thought proper to acknowledge her for his daughter, but that if circumstances made it necessary, he should in the meantime write to her, and he now gave her a direction by which to address him under a fictitious name, and at a place remote from his convent. Elena, though assured of the necessity for this conduct, could not yield to such disguise without an aversion that was strongly expressed in her manner, but of which Schedoni took no notice. He bade her, as she valued her existence, watchfully to preserve the secret of her birth, and to waste not a single day at the Ville Altieri, but to retire to the Santa della Pieta, and these injunctions were delivered in a manner so solemn and energetic as not only deeply to impress upon her mind the necessity of fulfilling them, but to excite some degree of amazement. After a short and general direction respecting her further conduct, Schedoni bade her farewell, and privately quitting the villa in his ecclesiastical dress, repaired to the Dominican convent, which he entered as a brother returned from a distant pilgrimage. He was received as usual by the society, and found himself once more the austere Father Schedoni of Spirito Santo. The cause of his first anxiety was the necessity for justifying himself to the Marchesa di Vivaldi, for ascertaining how much he might venture to reveal of the truth, and for estimating what would be her decision were she informed of the whole. His second step would be to obtain the release of Vivaldi, and as his conduct in this instance would be regulated in a great degree by the result of his conference with the Marchesa, it would only be the second. However painful it must be to Schedoni to meet her, now that he had discovered the depth of the guilt in which she would have involved him, he determined to seek this eventful conference on the following morning, and he passed this night partly in uneasy expectation of the approaching day, but chiefly in inventing circumstances and arranging arguments that might bear him triumphantly towards the accomplishment of his grand design. End of Chapter 23. Reading by Marty Chris. The Italian by Ann Radcliffe.
Chapter 24.
Beneath the silent gloom of solitude, though peace can sit and smile, though meek content can keep the cheerful tenor of her soul, even in the loneliest shades, yet let not wrath approach. Let black revenge keep far aloof, or soon they flame to madness. Elfrida. Schedoni, on his way to the Vivaldi palace, again reviewed and arranged every argument, or rather specious circumstances, which might induce the Marchesa's consent to the nuptials he so much desired. His family was noble, though no longer wealthy, and he believed that as the seeming want of descent had hitherto been the chief objection of Elena, the Marchesa might be prevailed to overlook the wreck of his fortune. At the palace he was told that the Marchesa was at one of her villas on the bay, and he was too anxious not to follow her thither immediately. This delightful residence was situated on an airy promontory that overhung the water, and was nearly embosomed among the woods that spread far along the heights, and descended with great pomp of foliage and colouring to the very margin of the waves. It seemed scarcely possible that misery could inhabit so enchanting an abode. Yet the Marchesa was wretched amidst all these luxuries of nature and art, which would have perfected the happiness of an innocent mind. Her heart was possessed by evil passions, and all her perceptions were distorted and discolored by them, which, like a dark magician, had power to change the fairest scenes into those of gloom and desolation. The servants had orders to admit Father Schedoni at all times, and he was shewn into a saloon in which the Marchesa was alone. Every object in this apartment announced taste and even magnificence. The hangings were of purple and gold. The vaulted ceiling was designed by one of the first painters of the Venetian school. The marble statues that adorned the recesses were not less exquisite, and the whole symmetry and architecture, airy yet rich, gay yet chastened, resembled the palace of a fairy, and seemed to possess almost equal fascinations. The lattices were thrown open to admit the prospect as well as the air loaded with fragrance from the orangery that spread before them. Lofty palms and plantains threw their green and refreshing tint over the windows, and on the lawn that sloped to the edge of the precipice, a shadowy perspective beyond which appeared the ample waters of the Gulf, where the light sails of Felicus and the spreading canvas of larger vessels glided upon the scene and passed away as in a camera obscura. Vesuvius and the city of Naples were seen on the coast beyond, with many a bay and lofty cape of that long tract of boldly, gaily colored scenery which extends towards Cape Campanella, crowned by fading ranges of mountains, lighted up with all the magic of Italian sunshine. The Marchesa reclined on a sofa before an open lattice. Her eyes were fixed upon the prospect without, but her attention was wholly occupied by the visions that evil passions painted to her imagination. On her still beautiful features was the languor and discontent and indisposition, and though her manners, like her dress, displayed the elegant negligence of the Graces, they concealed the movements of a careful and even a tortured heart. On perceiving Schedoni, a faint smile lightened upon her countenance, and she held forth her hand to him, at the touch of which he shuddered. "My good father, I rejoice to see you," said the Marchesa. "I have felt the want of your conversation much, and at this moment of indisposition especially." She waved the attendant to withdraw, while Schedoni, stalking to a window, could with difficulty conceal the perturbation with which he now, for the first time, consciously beheld the willing destroyer of his child. Some farther compliment from the Marchesa recalled him. He soon recovered all his address, and approaching her, said, "Daughter, you always send me away a worse Dominican than I come. I approach you with humility, but depart elated with pride, and am obliged to suffer much from self-infliction before I can descend to my proper level." After some other flatteries had been exchanged, a silence of several moments followed, during which neither of the parties seemed to have sufficient courage to introduce the subjects that engaged their thoughts, subjects upon which their interests were now so directly and unexpectedly opposite. Had Schedoni been less occupied by his own feelings, he might have perceived the extreme agitation of the Marchesa, the tremor of her nerves, the faint flush that crossed her cheek, the wanness that succeeded, the languid movement of her eyes, and the laborious sighs that interrupted her breathing, while she wished, yet dared not ask, whether Elena was no more, and averted her regards from him whom she almost believed to be a murderer. Schedoni, not less affected, though apparently tranquil, as sedulously avoided the face of the Marchesa, whom he considered with a degree of contempt almost equal to his indignation. His feelings had reversed, for the present, all high opinions on the subject of their former arguments, and had taught him, for once, to think justly. Every moment of silence now increased his embarrassment, and his reluctance even to name Elena. He feared to tell that she lived, yet despised himself for suffering such fear, and shuddered at a recollection of the conduct which had made any assurance concerning her life necessary. The insinuations that he had discovered her family to be such as would not degrade that of the Marchesa, he knew not how to introduce with such delicacy of gradation as might win upon the jealousy of her pride, and soothe her disappointment. and he was still meditating how he might lead to this subject, when the Marchesa herself broke the silence. "Father," she said with a sigh, "I always look to you for consolation, and am seldom disappointed. You are too well acquainted with the anxiety which has long oppressed me. May I understand that the cause of it is removed?" She paused, and then added, "May I hope that my son will no longer be led from the observance of his duty?" Schedoni, with his eyes fixed on the ground, remained silent, but at length said, "The chief occasion of your anxiety is certainly removed," and he was again silent. "How?" exclaimed the Marchesa, with the quick-sightedness of suspicion, while all her dissimulation yielded to the urgency of her fear. "Have you failed? Is she not dead?" In the earnestness of the question she fixed her eyes on Schedoni's face, and, perceiving their symptoms of extraordinary emotion, added, "Relieve me from my apprehensions, good father, I entreat. Tell me that you have succeeded, and that she has paid the debt of justice." Schedoni raised his eyes to the Marchesa, but instantly averted them. Indignation had lifted them, and disgust and stifled horror turned them away. Though very little of these feelings appeared, the Marchesa perceived such expression as she had never been accustomed to observe in his countenance, and her surprise and impatience increasing, she once more repeated the question, and with a yet more decisive air than before. "I have not failed in the grand object," replied Schedoni. "Your son is no longer in danger of forming a disgraceful alliance." "In what, then, have you failed?" asked the Marchesa, "for I perceive that you have not been completely successful." "I ought not to say that I have failed in any respect," replied Schedoni, with emotion, "since the honor of your house is preserved, and a life is spared." His voice faltered as he pronounced the last words, and he seemed to experience again the horror of that moment when, with an uplifted poniard in his grasp, he had discovered Elena for his daughter. "Spared!" repeated the Marchesa doubtingly. "Explain yourself, good father." "She lives," replied Schedoni, "but you have nothing, therefore, to apprehend." The Marchesa, surprised no less by the tone in which he spoke than shocked at the purport of his words, changed countenance, while she said impatiently, "You speak in enigmas, father." "Lady, I speak plain truth. She lives." "I understand that sufficiently," said the Marchesa, "but when you tell me I have nothing to apprehend—" "I tell you truth also," rejoined the confessor, "and the benevolence of your nature may be permitted to rejoice, for justice no longer has forbade the exercise of mercy." "This is all very well in its place," said the Marchesa, betrayed by the vexation she suffered. "Such sentiments and such compliments are like gala suits, to be put on in fine weather. My day is cloudy. Let me have a little plain, strong sense. Inform me of the circumstances which have occasioned this change in the course of your observations, and, good father, be brief." Schedoni then unfolded, with unusual art, such circumstances relative to the family of Elena as he hoped would soften the aversion of the Marchesa to the connection, and incline her, in consideration of her son's happiness, finally to approve it, with which disclosure he mingled a plausible relation of the way in which the discovery had been made. The Marchesa's patience would scarcely await the conclusion of his narrative, or her disappointment submit to the curb of discretion. When at length he had finished his history, "It is possible," said she, with fretful displeasure, "that you have suffered yourself to be deceived by the plausibility of a girl who might have been expected to utter any falsehood which should appear likely to protect her. Has a man of your discernment given faith to the idle and improbable tale? Say rather, father, that your resolution failed to the critical moment, and that you are now anxious to form excuses to yourself for a conduct so pusillanimous. I am not apt to give an easy faith to appearances, replied Schedoni gravely, and still less to shrink from the performance of any act which I judge to be necessary and just. To the last intimation I make no reply. It does not become my character to vindicate myself from an implication of falsehood. The Marchesa, perceiving that her passion had betrayed her into imprudence, condescended to apologize for that which she termed an effect of her extreme anxiety as to what might follow from an act of such indiscreet indulgence, and Schedoni as willingly accepted the apology, each believing the assistance of the other necessary to success. Schedoni then informed her that he had better authority for what he had advanced than the assertion of Elena, and he mentioned some circumstances which proved him to be more anxious for the reputation than for the truth of his word. Believing that his origin was entirely unknown to the Marchesa, he ventured to disclose some particulars of Elena's family, without apprehending that it could lead to a suspicion of his own. The Marchesa, though neither appeased or convinced, commanded her feelings so far as to appear tranquil, while the confessor represented with the most delicate address the unhappiness of her son, and the satisfaction which must finally result to herself from an acquiescence with his choice, since the object of it was known to be worthy of his alliance. He added that while he had believed the contrary, he had proved himself as strenuous to prevent, and he was now sincere in approving their marriage, and concluded with gently blaming her for suffering prejudice and some remains of resentment to obscure her excellent understanding. Trusting to the natural clearness of your perceptions, he added, I doubt not that when you have maturely considered the subject, every objection will yield to a consideration of your son's happiness. The earnestness with which Schedoni pleaded for Vivaldi excited some surprise, but the Marchesa, without condescending to reply either to his argument or remonstrance, inquired whether Elena had a suspicion of the design with which she had been carried into the forests of the Garganus, or concerning the identity of her persecutor. Schedoni, immediately perceiving to what these questions tended, replied with the facility with which he usually accommodated his conscience to his interest, that Elena was totally ignorant as to who were her immediate persecutors, and equally unsuspicious of any other evil having been intended her than that of a temporary confinement. The last assertion was admitted by the Marchesa to be probable, till the boldness of the first made her doubt the truth of each, and occasioned her new surprise and conjecture as to the motive which could induce Schedoni to venture these untruths. She then inquired where Elena was now disposed of, but he had too much prudence to disclose the place of her retreat, however plausible might be the air with which the inquiry was urged, and he endeavored to call off her attention to Vivaldi. The confessor did not, however, venture at present to give a hint as to the pretended discovery of his situation in the Inquisition, but reserved to a more favorable opportunity such mention, together with the zealous offer of his services to extricate the prisoner. The Marchesa, believing that her son was still engaged in pursuit of Elena, made many inquiries concerning him, but without expressing any solicitude for his welfare, resentment appearing to be the only emotion she retained towards him. While Schedoni replied with circumspection to her questions, he urged inquiries of his own as to the manner in which the Marchesa endured the long absence of Vivaldi, thus endeavoring to ascertain how far he might hereafter venture to appear in any efforts for liberating him, and how shape his conduct respecting Elena. It seemed that the Marchesa was not indifferent as to her son's absence, and though he had at first believed the search for Elena to have occasioned it, other apprehensions now disturbed him, and taught him the feelings of a father. His numerous avocations and interests, however, seemed to prevent such anxiety from preying upon his mind, and, having dismissed persons in search of Vivaldi, he passed his time in the usual routine of company and the court. Of the actual situation of his son, it was evident that neither he nor the Marchesa had the least apprehension, and this was a circumstance which the confessor was very careful to ascertain. Before he took leave, he ventured to renew the mention of Vivaldi's attachment, and gently to plead for him. The Marchesa, however, seemed inattentive to what he represented, till at length, awakening from her reverie, she said, "Father, you have judged ill," and before she concluded the sentence she relapsed again into thoughtful silence. Believing that he anticipated her meaning, Schedoni began to repeat his own justification respecting his conduct towards Elena. "You have judged erroneously, father," resumed the Marchesa, with the same considering air. "In placing the girl in such a situation, my son cannot fail to discover her there." "Or wherever she may be," replied the confessor, believing that he understood the Marchesa's aim. "It may not be possible to conceal her long from his search." "The neighborhood of Naples ought at least to have been avoided," observed the Marchesa. Schedoni was silent, and she added, "So near also to his own residence. How far is the Santa della Pieta from the Vivaldi palace?" Though Schedoni had thought that the Marchesa, while displaying a pretended knowledge of Elena's retreat, was only endeavoring to obtain a real one, this mention of the place of her actual residence shocked him. But he replied almost immediately, "I am ignorant of the distance, for till now I was unacquainted that there is a convent of the name you mention. It appears, however, that this Santa della Pieta is the place of all other which ought to have been avoided. How could you suspect me, lady, of imprudence thus extravagant?" While Schedoni spoke, the Marchesa regarded him attentively, and then replied, "I may be allowed, good father, to suspect your prudence in this instance, since you have just given me so unequivocal a proof of it in another." She would then have changed the subject, but Schedoni, believing this inclination to be the consequence of her having assured herself that she had actually discovered Elena's asylum, and too reasonably suspecting the dreadful use she designed to make of the discovery, endeavored to unsettle her opinion and mislead her as to the place of Elena's abode. He not only contradicted the fact of her present residence at the Santa della Pieta, but without scruple made a positive assertion that she was at a distance from Naples, naming at the same time a fictitious place whose obscurity, he added, would be the best protection from the pursuit of Vivaldi. "Very true, father," observed the Marchesa. "I believe that my son will not readily discover the girl in the place you have named." Whether the Marchesa believed Schedoni's assertion or not, she expressed no farther curiosity on the subject, and appeared considerably more tranquil than before. She now chatted with ease on general topics, while the confessor dared no more to urge the subject of his secret wishes, and having supported for some time a conversation most uncongenial with his temper, he took his leave and returned to Naples. On the way thither he reviewed with exactness the late behavior of the Marchesa, and the result of this examination was a resolution, never to renew the subject of their conversation, but to solemnize, without her consent, the nuptials of Vivaldi and Elena. The Marchesa, meanwhile, on the departure of Schedoni, remained in the attitude in which he had left her, and absorbed by the interest which his visit excited. The sudden change in his conduct no less astonished and perplexed than disappointed her. She could not explain it by the supposition of any principle or motive. Sometimes it occurred to her that Vivaldi had bribed him with rich promises to promote the marriage, which he contributed to thwart. But when she considered the high expectations she had herself encouraged him to cherish, the improbability of the conjecture was apparent. That Schedoni, from whatever cause, was no longer to be trusted in this business was sufficiently clear, but she endeavored to console herself with a hope that a more confidential person might yet be discovered. A part of Schedoni's resolution she also adopted, which was never again to introduce the subject of their late conversation. But while she should silently pursue her own plans, she determined to conduct herself towards Schedoni in every other respect as usual, not suffering him to suspect that she had withdrawn her confidence, but inducing him to believe that she had relinquished all farther design against Helena. End of
Chapter 24.
Reading by Marty Chris.
Recording by Nadine Eckert-Boulet. The Italian by Ann Radcliffe.
Chapter 25.
We would learn the private virtues, how to glide through shades and plains, along the smoothest stream of rural life, or, snatched away by hope, through the dim spaces of futurity, with earnest eye anticipate those scenes of happiness and wonder where the mind, in endless growth and infinite ascent, rises from state to state and world to world. Thomson. Helena, obedient to the command of Schedoni, withdrew from her home on the day that followed her arrival there, to the Centre della Pietà. The superior, who had known her from her infancy, and, from the acquaintance which such long observation afforded, had both esteemed and loved her, received Helena with a degree of satisfaction proportionate to the concern she had suffered when informed of her disastrous removal from the Villa Altieri. Among the quiet groves of this convent, however, Helena vainly endeavoured to moderate her solicitude respecting the situation of Vivaldi; for, now that she had a respite from immediate calamity, she thought with more intense anxiety as to what might be his sufferings, and her fears and impatience increased as each day disappointed her expectation of intelligence from Schedoni. If the soothings of sympathy and the delicate arts of benevolence could have restored the serenity of her mind, Helena would now have been peaceful, for all these were offered her by the abbess and the sisters of the Santa della Pietà. They were not acquainted with the cause of her sorrow, but they perceived that she was unhappy, and wished her to be otherwise. The society of Our Lady of Pity was such as a convent does not often shroud. To the wisdom and virtue of the superior, the sisterhood was principally indebted for the harmony and happiness which distinguished them. This lady was a shining example to governesses of religious houses, and a striking instance of the influence which a virtuous mind may acquire over others, as well as of the extensive good that it may thus diffuse. She was dignified without haughtiness, religious without bigotry, and mild, though decisive and firm. She possessed penetration to discover what was just, resolution to adhere to it, and temper to practice it with gentleness and grace, so that even correction from her assumed the winning air of courtesy. The person whom she admonished wept in sorrow for the offence, instead of being secretly irritated by the reproof, and loved her as a mother rather than feared her as a judge. Whatever might be her failings, they were effectually concealed by the general benevolence of her heart and the harmony of her mind. A harmony, not the effect of torpid feelings, but the accomplishment of correct and vigilant judgment. Her religion was neither gloomy nor bigoted. It was the sentiment of a grateful heart offering itself up to a deity who delights in the happiness of his creatures, and she conformed to the customs of the Roman Church, without supposing a faith in all of them to be necessary to salvation. This opinion, however, she was obliged to conceal, lest her very virtue should draw upon her the punishment of a crime from some fierce ecclesiastics who contradicted in their practice the very essential principles which the Christianity they professed would have taught them. In her lectures to the nuns she seldom touched upon points of faith, but explained and enforced the moral duties, particularly such as were most practicable in the society to which she belonged, such as tended to soften and harmonize the affections, to impart that repose of mind which persuades to the practice of sisterly kindness, universal charity, and the most pure and elevated devotion. When she spoke of religion, it appeared so interesting, so beautiful, that her attentive auditors revered and loved it as a friend, a refiner of the heart, a sublime consoler, and experienced somewhat of the meek and holy ardor which may belong to angelic natures. The society appeared like a large family, of which the lady abbess was the mother, rather than an assemblage of strangers, and particularly when gathered around her, they listened to the evening sermon, which she delivered with such affectionate interest, such persuasive eloquence, and sometimes with such pathetic energy, as few hearts could resist. She encouraged in her convent every innocent and liberal pursuit which might sweeten the austerities of confinement, and which were generally rendered instrumental to charity. The daughters of Pity particularly excelled in music, not in those difficulties of the art which display florid graces and intricate execution, but in such eloquence of sound as stills upon the heart, and awakens its sweetest and best affections. It was probably the well-regulated sensibility of their own minds that enabled these sisters to diffuse through their strains a character of such finely tempered taste as drew crowds of visitors on every festival to the church of the Santa della Pieta. The local circumstances of this convent were scarcely less agreeable than the harmony of its society was interesting. These extensive domains included olive grounds, vineyards, and some cornland. A considerable tract was devoted to the pleasures of the garden, whose groves supplied walnuts, almonds, oranges, and citrons, in abundance, and almost every kind of fruit and flower which this luxurious climate nurtured. These gardens hung upon the slope of a hill, about a mile within the shore, and afforded extensive views of the country round Naples, and of the Gulf. But from the terraces, which extended along a semicircular range of rocks that rose over the convent, and formed a part of the domain, the prospects were infinitely finer. They extended on the south to the Isle of Caprea, where the gulf expands into the sea. In the west appeared the islet of Ischia, distinguished by the white pinnacles of the lofty mountain Epomeo, and near it Procida, with its many-colored cliffs, rose out of the waves. Overlooking many points towards Pozzuoli, the eye caught beyond other promontories, and others further still, to the north, a glimpse of the sea that bathes the now desolate shores of Bahia, with Capua and all the towns and villas that speckle the garden plains between Caserta and Naples. In the nearer scene were the rocky heights of Pausilippo, and Naples itself, with all its crowded suburbs ascending among the hills, and mingling with vineyards and overtopping cypress; the castle of San Elmo, conspicuous on its rock, overhanging the magnificent monastery of the Chartreux, while in the scene below appeared the Castel Nuovo, with its clustered towers, the long extended Corso, the mole, with its tall pharos, and the harbour gay with painted shipping, and full to the brim with the blue waters of the bay. Beyond the hills of Naples, the whole horizon to the north and east was bounded by the mountains of the Apennine, an amphitheatre proportioned to the grandeur of the plain, which the gulf spread out below. These terraces, shaded with acacias and plane trees, were the favorite haunt of Helena. Between the opening branches she looked down upon Villa Altieri, which brought to her remembrance the affectionate Bianchi, with all the sportive years of her childhood, and where some of her happiest hours had been passed in the society of Vivaldi. Along the windings of the coast, too, she could distinguish many places rendered sacred by affection, to which she had made excursions with her lamented relative and Vivaldi, and, though sadness mingled with the recollections a view of them restored, they were precious to her heart. Here, alone and unobserved, she frequently yielded to the melancholy which she endeavoured to suppress in society, and at other times tried to deceive, with books and the pencil, the lingering moments of uncertainty concerning the state of Vivaldi, for day after day still elapsed without bringing any intelligence from Schedoni. Whenever the late scenes connected with the discovery of her family recurred to Helena, she was struck with almost as much amazement as if she was gazing upon a vision instead of recalling realities. Contrasted with the sober truth of her present life, the past appeared like romance, and there were moments when she shrunk from the relationship of Schedoni with unconquerable affright. The first emotions his appearance had excited were so opposite to those of filial tenderness that she perceived it was now nearly impossible to love and revere him as her father, and she endeavoured, by dwelling upon all the obligations which she believed he had lately conferred upon her, to repay him in gratitude what was withheld in affection. In such melancholy considerations she often lingered under the shade of the acacias, till the sun had sunk behind the far distant promontory of Miseno, and the last bell of vespers summoned her to the convent below. Among the nuns Helena had many favourites, but not one that she admired and loved equally with Olivia of San Stefano, the remembrance of whom was always accompanied with a fear lest she should have suffered from her generous compassion, and a wish that she had taken up her abode with the happy society of the Daughters of Pity, instead of being subjected to the tyranny of the Abbess of San Stefano. To Helena, the magnificent scenes of the Santa della Pieta seemed to open a secure and, perhaps, a last asylum; for, in her present circumstances, she could not avoid perceiving how menacing and various were the objections to her marriage with Vivaldi, even should Schedoni prove propitious to it. The character of the Marchesa di Vivaldi, such as it stood unfolded by the late occurrences, struck her with dismay, for her designs appeared sufficiently atrocious, whether they had extended to the utmost limit of Helena's suspicions, or had stopped where the affected charity of Schedoni had pointed out. In either case, the pertinacity of her aversion, and the vindictive violence of her nature, were obvious. In this view of her character, however, it was not the inconvenience threatened to those who might become connected with her that principally affected Helena, but the circumstance of such a woman being the mother of Vivaldi; and, to alleviate so afflicting a consideration, she endeavoured to believe all the palliating suggestions of Schedoni respecting the Marchesa's late intentions. But if Helena was grieved on discovering crime in the character of Vivaldi's parent, what would have been her suffering had she suspected the nature of Schedoni? What if she had been told that he was the adviser of the Marchesa's plans? If she had known that he had been the partner of her intentional guilt? From such suffering she was yet spared, as well as from that which a knowledge of Vivaldi's present situation, and of the result of Schedoni's efforts to procure a release from the perils among which she had precipitated him, would have inflicted. Had she known this, it is probable that in the first despondency of her mind she would have relinquished what is called the world, and sought a lasting asylum with the society of the Holy Sisters. Even as it was, she sometimes endeavoured to look with resignation upon the events which might render such a step desirable; but it was an effort that seldom soothed her, even with a temporary self-delusion. Should the veil, however, prove her final refuge, it would be by her own choice; for the Lady Abbess of the Santa della Pieta employed no art to win a recluse, nor suffered the nuns to seduce votaries to the order.
End of chapter 25. Reading by Marty Chris. The Italian by Ann Radcliffe. Part 1 of
Chapter 26.
Sullen and sad to fancy's frighted eye did the shapes of dun and murky hue advance, in train tumultuous, all of gesture strange, and passing horrible. Caractacus. While the late events had been passing in the Garganus and at Naples, Vivaldi and his servant Paolo remained imprisoned in the distinct chambers of the Inquisition. They were again separately interrogated. From the servant no information could be obtained. He asserted only his master's innocence, without once remembering to mention his own, clamored with more justice than prudence against the persons who occasioned his arrest, seriously endeavoring to convince the inquisitors that he himself had no other motive in having demanded to be brought to these prisons than that he might comfort his master. He gravely remonstrated on the injustice of separating them, adding that he was sure when they knew the rights of the matter, they would order him to be carried to the prison of Signor Vivaldi. "I do assure your Serenissimo Illustrissimo," continued Paolo, addressing the chief inquisitor with profound gravity, "that this is the last place I should have thought of coming to on any other account, and if you will only condescend to ask your officials who took my master up, they will tell you as good. They knew well enough all along what I came here for, and if they had known it would be all in vain, it would have been but civil of them to have told me as much, and not have brought me, for this is the last place in the world I would have come to, otherwise of my own accord." Paolo was permitted to harangue in his own way, because his examiners hoped that his proximity would be a means of betraying circumstances connected with his master. By this view, however, they were misled, for Paolo, with all his simplicity of heart, was both vigilant and shrewd in Vivaldi's interests. But when he perceived them really convinced that his sole motive for visiting the Inquisition was that he might console his master, yet still persisting in the resolution of separately confining him, his indignation knew no bounds. He despised alike their reprehension, their thundering menaces, and their more artful exhibitions, told them of all they had to expect both here and hereafter for their cruelty to his dear master, and said they might do what they would with him. He defied them to make him more miserable than he was. It was not without difficulty that he was removed from the chamber, where he left his examiners in a state of astonishment at his rashness and indignation of his honesty, such as they had probably never experienced before. When Vivaldi was again called up to the table of the Holy Office, he underwent a longer examination than on a former occasion. Several inquisitors attended, and every art was employed to induce him to confess crimes of which he was suspected, and to draw from him a discovery of others which might have eluded even suspicion. Still, the examiners cautiously avoided informing him of the subject of the accusation on which he had been arrested, and it was therefore only on the former assurances of the Benedictine and the officials in the chapel of San Sebastian that Vivaldi understood he was accused of having carried off a nun. His answers on the present occasion were concise and firm, and his whole deportment undaunted. He felt less apprehension for himself than indignation of the general injustice and cruelty which the tribunal was permitted to exercise upon others, and this virtuous indignation gave a loftiness, a calm heroic grandeur to his mind, which never for a moment forsook him, except when he conjectured what might be the sufferings of Elena. Then his fortitude and magnanimity failed, and his tortured spirit rose almost to frenzy. On this, his second examination, he was urged by the same dark questions, and replied to them with the same open sincerity as during the first. Yet the simplicity and energy of truth failed to impress conviction on minds which, no longer possessing the virtue themselves, were not competent to understand the symptoms of it in others. Vivaldi was again threatened with the torture, and again dismissed to the prison. On the way to this dreadful abode, a person passed him in one of the avenues, of whose air and figure he thought he had some recollection, and as the stranger stalked away, he suddenly knew him to be the prophetic monk who had haunted him among the ruins of the Paluzzi. In the first moment of surprise, Vivaldi lost his presence of mind so far that he made no attempt to interrupt him. In the next instant, however, he paused and looked back, with an intention of speaking, but this mysterious person was already at the extremity of the avenue. Vivaldi called and besought him to stop. Without either speaking or turning his head, however, he immediately disappeared beyond a door that opened at his approach. Vivaldi, on attempting to take the way of the monk, was withheld by his guards, and when he inquired who was the stranger he had seen, the officials asked in their turn what stranger he alluded to. "He who has just passed us," replied Vivaldi. The officials seemed surprised. "Your spirits are disordered, senor," observed one of them. "I saw no person pass." "He passed so closely," said Vivaldi, "that it was hardly possible you could avoid seeing him." "I did not even hear a footstep," added the man. "I do not recollect that I did," answered Vivaldi, "but I saw his figure as plainly as I now see yours. His black garments almost touched me. Was he an inquisitor?" The official appeared astonished, and whether his surprise was real or affected for the purpose of concealing his knowledge of the person alluded to, his embarrassment and awe seemed natural. Vivaldi observed with almost equal curiosity and surprise the fear which his face expressed, but perceived also that it would avail nothing to repeat his questions. As they proceeded along the avenue, a kind of half-stifled groan was almost audible from a distance. "Whence come those sounds?" said Vivaldi. "They strike to my heart." "They should do so," replied the guard. "Whence come they?" repeated Vivaldi, more impatiently and shuddering. "From the place of torture," said the official. "O God! O God!" exclaimed Vivaldi with a deep groan. He passed with hasty steps the door of that terrible chamber, and the guard did not attempt to stop him. The officials had brought him, in obedience to the customary orders they had received, within hearing of those doleful sounds, for the purpose of impressing upon his mind the horrors of the punishment with which he had been threatened, and of inducing him to confess without incurring them. On the same evening Vivaldi was visited in his prison by a man whom he had never consciously seen before. He appeared to be between 40 and 50, was of a grave and observant physiognomy, and of manners which, though somewhat austere, were not alarming. The account he gave of himself and of his motive for this visit was curious. He said that he was also a prisoner in the Inquisition, but as the ground of accusation against him was light, he had been favored so far as to be allowed some degree of liberty within certain bounds, that having heard of Vivaldi's situation, he had asked and obtained leave to converse with him, which he had done in compassion, and with a desire of assuaging his sufferings so far as an expression of sympathy and commiseration might relieve them. While he spoke, Vivaldi regarded him with deep attention, and the improbability that these pretensions should be true did not escape him, but the suspicion which they occasioned he prudently concealed. The stranger conversed on various subjects. Vivaldi's answers were cautious and concise, but not even long pauses of silence wearied the compassionate patience of his visitor. Among other topics he at length introduced that of religion. "I have myself been accused of heresy," said he, "and know how to pity others in the same situation." "It is of heresy, then, that I am accused," interrupted Vivaldi. "Of heresy!" "It availed me nothing that I asserted my innocence," continued the stranger, without noticing Vivaldi's exclamation. "I was condemned to the torture. My sufferings were too terrible to be endured. I confessed my offense." "Pardon me," interrupted Vivaldi, "but allow me to observe that since your sufferings were so severe, yours, against whom the ground of accusation was light, what may be the punishment of those whose offenses are more serious?" The stranger was somewhat embarrassed. "My offense was slight," he continued, without giving a full answer. "Is it possible," said Vivaldi, again interrupting him, "that heresy can be considered as a slight offense before the tribunal of the Inquisition?" "It was only of a slight degree of heresy," replied the visitor, reddening with displeasure, "that I was suspected, and—" "Does, then, the Inquisition allow of degrees in heresy?" said Vivaldi. "I confessed my offense," added the stranger with a louder emphasis, "and the consequence of this confession was a remission of punishment. After a trifling penance I shall be dismissed, and probably in a few days leave the prison. Before I left it, I was desirous of administering some degree of consolation to a fellow sufferer. If you have any friends whom you wish to inform of your situation, do not fear to confide their names and your message to me." The latter part of this speech was delivered in a low voice, as if the stranger feared to be overheard. Vivaldi remained silent, while he examined with closer attention the countenance of his visitor. It was of the utmost importance to him that his family should be made acquainted with his situation, yet he knew not exactly how to interpret or to confide in this offer. Vivaldi had heard that informers sometimes visited the prisoners, and, under the affectation of kindness and sympathy, drew from them a confession of opinions which were afterwards urged against them, and obtained discoveries relative to their connections and friends, who were by these insidious means frequently involved in their destruction. Vivaldi, conscious of his own innocence, had on his first examination acquainted the inquisitor with the names and residence of his family. He had therefore nothing new to apprehend from revealing them to this stranger, but he perceived that if it should be known he had attempted to convey a message, however concise and harmless, the discovery would irritate the jealous inquisitors against him, and might be urged as a new presumption of his guilt. These considerations, together with the distrust which the inconsistency of his visitor's assertions and the occasional embarrassment of his manner had awakened, determined Vivaldi to resist the temptation now offered to him, and the stranger, having received his thanks, reluctantly withdrew, observing, however, that should any unforeseen circumstance detain him in the Inquisition longer than he had reason to expect, he should beg leave to pay him another visit. In reply to this, Vivaldi only bowed, but he remarked that the stranger's countenance changed, and that some dark brooding appeared to cloud his mind as he quitted the chamber. Several days elapsed, during which Vivaldi heard no more of his new acquaintance. He was then summoned to another examination, from which he was dismissed as before, and some weeks of solitude and of heavy uncertainty succeeded, after which he was a fourth time called up to the table of the Holy Office. It was then surrounded by inquisitors, and a more than usual solemnity appeared in the proceedings. As proofs of Vivaldi's innocence had not been obtained, the suspicions of his examiners of course were not removed, and as he persisted in denying the truth of the charge which he understood would be exhibited against him, and refused to make any confession of crimes, it was ordered that he should, within 3 hours, be put to the question. Till then, Vivaldi was once more dismissed to his prison chamber. His resolution remained unshaken, but he could not look unmoved upon the horrors which might be preparing for him. The interval of expectation between the sentence and the accomplishment of this preliminary punishment was indeed dreadful. The seeming ignominy of his situation, and his ignorance as to the degree of torture to be applied, overcame the calmness he had before exhibited, and as he paced his cell, cold damps which hung upon his forehead betrayed the agony of his mind. It was not long, however, that he suffered from a sense of ignominy. His better judgment shewed him that innocence cannot suffer disgrace from any situation or circumstance, and he once more resumed the courage and the firmness which belong to virtue. It was about midnight that Vivaldi heard steps approaching and a murmur of voices at the door of his cell. He understood these to be the persons come to summon him to the torture. The door was unbarred, and 2 men habited in black appeared at it. Without speaking, they advanced, and throwing over him a singular kind of mantle, led him from the chamber. Along the galleries and other avenues through which they passed, not any person was seen, and by the profound stillness that reigned, it seemed as if death had already anticipated his work in these regions of horror, and had condemned alike the tortured and the torturer. They descended to the large hall where Vivaldi had waited on the night of his entrance, and thence through the avenue and down a long flight of steps that led to subterranean chambers. His conductors did not utter a syllable during the whole progress. Vivaldi knew too well that questions would only subject him to greater severity, and he asked none. The doors through which they passed regularly opened at the touch of an iron rod carried by one of the officials, and without the appearance of any person. The other man bore a torch, and the passages were so dimly lighted that the way could scarcely have been found without one. They crossed what seemed to be a burial vault, but the extent and obscurity of the place did not allow it to be ascertained, and, having reached an iron door, they stopped. One of the officials struck upon it 3 times with the rod, but it did not open as the others had done. While they waited, Vivaldi thought he heard from within low intermitting sounds, as of persons in their last extremity, but though within they appeared to come from a distance, his whole heart was chilled, not with fear, for at that moment he did not remember himself, but with horror. Having waited a considerable time, during which the official did not repeat the signal, the door was partly opened by a person whom Vivaldi could not distinguish in the gloom beyond, and with whom one of his conductors communicated by signs, after which the door was closed. Several minutes had elapsed when tones of deep voices aroused the attention of Vivaldi. They were loud and hoarse, and spoke in a language unknown to him. At the sounds the official immediately extinguished his torch. The voices drew nearer, and the door again unfolding, 2 figures stood before Vivaldi, which, shewn by a glimmering light within, struck him with astonishment and dismay. They were clothed, like his conductors, in black, but in a different fashion, for their habits were made close to the shape. Their faces were entirely concealed beneath a very peculiar kind of cowl, which descended from the head to the feet, and their eyes only were visible through small openings contrived for the sight. It occurred to Vivaldi that these men were torturers. Their appearance was worthy of demons. Probably they were thus habited that the persons whom they afflicted might not know them, or perhaps it was only for the purpose of striking terror upon the minds of the accused, and thus compelling them to confess without further difficulty. Whatever motive might have occasioned their horrific appearance, and whatever was their office, Vivaldi was delivered into their hands, and in the same moment heard the iron door shut, which enclosed him with them in a narrow passage, gloomily lighted by a lamp suspended from the arched roof. They walked in silence on each side of their prisoner, and came to a second door, which admitted them instantly into another passage. A third door at a short distance admitted them to a third avenue, at the end of which one of his mysterious guides struck upon a gate, and they stopped. The uncertain sounds that Vivaldi had fancied he heard were now more audible, and he distinguished, with inexpressible horror, that they were uttered by persons suffering. The gate was, at length, opened by a figure habited like his conductors, and 2 other doors of iron, placed very near each other, being also unlocked, Vivaldi found himself in a spacious chamber, the walls of which were hung with black, duskily lighted by lamps that gleamed in the lofty vault. Immediately on his entrance a strange sound ran along the walls and echoed among other vaults, that appeared by the progress of the sound to extend far beyond this. It was not immediately that Vivaldi could sufficiently recollect himself to observe any object before him, and even when he did so, the gloom of the place prevented his ascertaining many appearances. Shadowy countenances and uncertain forms seemed to flit through the dusk, and many instruments, the application of which he did not comprehend, struck him with horrible suspicions. Still he heard, at intervals, half-suppressed groans, and was looking round to discover the wretched people from whom they were extorted, when a voice from a remote part of the chamber called on him to advance. The distance and the obscurity of the spot whence the voice issued had prevented Vivaldi from noticing any person there, and he was now slowly obeying, when, on a second summons, his conductors seized his arms and hurried him forward. In a remote part of this extensive chamber he perceived 3 persons seated under a black canopy, on chairs raised several steps from the floor, and who appeared to preside there in the office of either judges or examiners or directors of the punishments. Below at a table sat a secretary, over whom was suspended the only lamp that could enable him to commit to paper what should occur during the examination. Vivaldi now understood that the three persons who composed the tribunal were the Vicar General, or Grand Inquisitor, the Advocate of the Exchequer, and an ordinary inquisitor, who was seated between the other two, and who appeared more eagerly to engage in the duties of this cruel office. A portentous obscurity enveloped alike their persons and their proceedings. At some distance from the tribunal stood a large iron frame which Vivaldi conjectured to be the rack, and near it another, resembling in shape a coffin, but happily he could not distinguish through the remote obscurity any person undergoing actual suffering. In the vaults beyond, however, the diabolical decrees of the inquisitors seemed to be fulfilling, for whenever a distant door opened for a moment, sounds of lamentation issued forth, and men whom he judged to be familiars, habited like those who stood beside him, were seen passing to and fro within. Vivaldi almost believed himself in the infernal regions. The dismal aspect of this place, the horrible preparation for punishment, and above all, the disposition and appearance of the persons that were ready to inflict it, confirmed the resemblance. That any human being should willingly afflict a fellow being who had never injured or even offended him, that unswayed by passion he should deliberately become the means of torturing him, appeared to Vivaldi nearly incredible. But when he looked at the three persons who composed the tribunal, and considered that they had not only voluntarily undertaken the cruel office they fulfilled, but had probably long regarded it as the summit of their ambition, his astonishment and indignation were unbounded. The Grand Inquisitor, having again called on Vivaldi by name, admonished him to confess the truth, and avoid the suffering that awaited him. As Vivaldi had on former examinations spoken the truth which was not believed, he had no chance of escaping present suffering but by asserting falsehood. In doing so, to avoid such monstrous injustice and cruelty, he might perhaps have been justified, had it been certain that such assertion could affect himself alone. But since he knew that the consequence must extend to others, and above all, believed that Elena di Rosaba must be involved in it, he did not hesitate for an instant to dare whatever torture his firmness might provoke. But even if mortality could have forgiven falsehood in such extraordinary circumstances as these, policy, after all, would have forbidden it, since a discovery of the artifice would probably have led to the final destruction of the accused person. Of Elena's situation he would now have asked, however desperate the question, would again have asserted her innocence, and supplicated for compassion even to inquisitors, had he not perceived that in doing so he should only furnish them with a more exquisite means of torturing him than any other they could apply. For if, when all the terrors of his soul concerning her were understood, they should threaten to increase her sufferings, as the punishment of what was termed his obstinacy, they would indeed become the masters of his integrity as well as his person. The tribunal again and repeatedly urged Vivaldi to confess himself guilty, and the inquisitor at length concluded with saying that the judges were innocent of whatever consequence might ensue from his obstinacy, so that if he expired beneath his sufferings, himself only, not they, would have occasioned his death. "I am innocent of the charges which I understand are urged against me," said Vivaldi with solemnity. "I repeat that I am innocent. If to escape the horrors of these moments I could be weak enough to declare myself guilty, not all your racks could alter truth, and make me so, except in that assertion. The consequence of your tortures, therefore, be upon your own heads." While Vivaldi spoke, the Vicar General listened with attention, and when he had ceased to speak, appeared to meditate. But the inquisitor was irritated by the boldness of his speech, instead of being convinced by the justness of his representation, and made a signal for the officers to prepare for the question. While they were obeying, Vivaldi observed, notwithstanding the agitation he suffered, a person cross the chamber, whom he immediately knew to be the same that had passed him in an avenue of the Inquisition on a former night, and whom he had then fancied to be the mysterious stranger of Paluzzi. Vivaldi now fixed his eyes upon him, but his own peculiar situation prevented his feeling the interest he had formerly suffered concerning him. The figure, air, and stalk of this person were so striking, and so strongly resembled those of the monk of Paluzzi, that Vivaldi had no longer a doubt as to their identity. He pointed him out to one of the officials, and inquired who he was. While he spoke, the stranger was passing forward, and before any reply was given, a door leading to the farther vaults shut him from view. Vivaldi, however, repeated the inquiry, which the official appeared unable to answer, and a reproof from the tribunal reminded him that he must not ask questions there. Vivaldi observed that it was the Grand Inquisitor who spoke, and that the manner of the official immediately changed. The familiars, who were the same that had conducted Vivaldi into the chamber, having made ready the instrument of torture, approached him, and after taking off his cloak and vest, bound him with strong cords. They threw over his head the customary black garment, which entirely enveloped his figure, and prevented his observing what was farther preparing. In this state of expectation he was again interrogated by the Inquisitor.
"Was you ever in the Church of the Spirito Santo at Naples?"
said he. "Yes," said Vivaldi.
"Did you ever express there a contempt for the Catholic faith?"
"Never," said Vivaldi.
"Neither by word or action?"
continued the Inquisitor. "Never by either."
"Recollect yourself," added the Inquisitor. "Did you ever insult there a minister of our most holy Church?"
Vivaldi was silent. He began to perceive the real nature of the charge which was to be urged against him, and that it was too plausible to permit his escape from the punishment which he is adjudged for heresy. Questions so direct and minute had never been put to him here on his former examinations. They had been reserved for a moment, when it was believed he could not evade them, and the real charge had been concealed from him, that he might not be prepared to elude it.
"Answer," repeated the Inquisitor. "Did you ever insult a minister of the Catholic faith in the Church of the Spirito Santo at Naples?" "Did you not insult him while he was performing an act of holy penance?"
said another voice. Vivaldi started, for he instantly recollected the well-known tones of the monk of Paluzzi. "Who asked the question?" demanded Vivaldi.
"It is you who are to answer here," resumed the Inquisitor. "Answer to what I have required."
"I have offended a minister of the Church," replied Vivaldi, "but never could intentionally insult our holy religion. You are not acquainted, fathers, with the injuries that provoked—"
"Enough!"
interrupted the Inquisitor.
"Speak to the question. Did you not, by insult and menace, force a pious brother to leave unperformed the act of penance in which he had engaged himself? Did you not compel him to quit the church and fly for refuge to his convent?"
"No," replied Vivaldi. "'Tis true he left the church, and that in consequence of my conduct there, but the consequence was not necessary. If he had only replied to my inquiry, or promised to restore her of whom he had treacherously robbed me, he might have remained quietly in the church till this moment, had that depended upon my forbearance."
"What!" said the Vicar General. "Would you have compelled him to speak when he was engaged in silent penance? You confess that you occasioned him to leave the church. That is enough." "Where did you first see Elena di Rosaba?" said the voice which had spoken once before.
"I demand again, who gives the question?" answered Vivaldi.
"Recollect yourself," said the Inquisitor. "A criminal cannot make demand."
"I do not perceive the connection between your admonition and your assertion," observed Vivaldi.
"You appear to be rather too much at your ease," said the Inquisitor. "Answer to the question which was last put to you, or the familiars shall do their duty."
"Let the same person ask it," replied Vivaldi. End of Part 1 of
Chapter 26.
Reading by Marty Chris.